this lesson, we are going to be setting up a basic object. We're going to be discussing what the differences are between JavaScript objects and JSON data, and then how we can structure and create named pair values, output the results of the values by referencing the main object container and then the property name in order to retrieve the value. And then we can use that within our JavaScript code. Okay, let's get started coding. Before we do that, I'll just run over how I've got the workspace set up. The editor is opened on the left-hand side. I've got an HTML file linking to a JS file. The JS file is going to be called apps1.js for the first lesson. On the right-hand side, I've got the browser window open. This is a Chrome browser with the DevTools console opened up at the bottom. So this way we can see outputs from the JavaScript code and live outputs coming from the editor. As we make the editor, it'll be reflected within the browser. The editor that I am using is going to be Visual Studio Code, and of course you can use any editor that you're most comfortable with. So once you're ready to start, open up your editor and let's get coding some JavaScript. We're going to create a first object. So in JavaScript, we create it as a variable, give it a name, and in order to indicate that this is going to be an object that we're using, we use the curly brackets. So that creates an object. We can output the object into the console by using the console log, and this will output the empty object into the console. JSON is based on JavaScript syntax, and it easily converts into JavaScript objects. This is why learning how to use the JavaScript objects is going to be important to being able to better understand JSON and the structure of the JSON syntax. There are some differences that we're going to be covering between JSON and JavaScript objects. In order to create a JavaScript object, they're structured as a key name pair value. So we assign a value for the key and separate it with a colon, and then use a value on the right-hand side to be represented by the key. The structure is always going to be with a key in order to identify the value, and the value can be different value types, such as objects, arrays, numbers, strings, booleans, and null values. For JSON and to be valid JSON structure, we do need to use the double quotes for the name. If we are using a string, then we use the double quotes on the right-hand side as well. So all names must be double quoted. We're not allowed to have a trailing comma. So if you don't have another property after the property that you've created, don't leave a trailing comma because this isn't going to be valid JSON. Although this will all work in JavaScript, when it comes to JSON structure, it's not going to be recognized. In the JavaScript, we're allowed to do methods or functions within the object. And when it comes to JSON, that's not going to be allowed. So that's also going to throw an error. So I'll show you the different types of data types that we can add in. So this would be a representation of a number. For the numbers, we don't need to quote around a number. You can do a boolean value, so those are the ones that are either going to be true or false. Once again, they don't need to have quotes around it in order to be proper structured. You can do a null value as well. So null is also a valid data type that you can use within the JSON structure. You can do arrays, and we're going to be looking at arrays in more detail in the upcoming lessons. So arrays are represented with the square brackets. There's also objects, so you can add in an object within an object. And that's one of the nice things about JSON and JavaScript objects is that it can hold a lot of data, and the way that it holds the data is a very readable, easy to understand structure. So it's humanly readable that you can go through and see that this is the object name, and when I do want to reference the content that's contained within this object, I can reference those values by using these key names. And the key names are represented on the left-hand side. You've got a colon that separates out the key name and the value. So in order to return back the value in JavaScript, there are two ways that you can reference the value. So you can use it by the dot notation. So that's indicating with the dot, and then whatever the value that we want to return back. So that's going to return back the value of Laurence, and that's being shown in the console. The bracket notation. So that's the second way that you can retrieve back data within JavaScript, and that's referencing the object and then specifying it within the bracket notation. So those are the square brackets, and then setting the property name within the brackets. So these two statements are both going to be returning back the same value, and the way that JavaScript code understands the value is that it looks at what the variable is, and this is the main container for all of the rest of the data. And then once you identify the main container, JavaScript code knows to recognize that this is the container, and then it's going to look for a value with this key name, either by the dot notation or by the bracket notation, and reference that. And then once it finds it, it will return back the value that it's being referred to. If we look at, and if we try to get a value that is not there, it's going to return back undefined. This is also case sensitive, so be careful of the case when you are trying to return back the values. You do need to make sure that the key name is represented by the case. When you are using the double quotes, you can also use spaces in there. And if you are using a space, the only way to return it back by the property name is to use the bracket notation, because if you try to use the dot notation, you're not going to be able to return it back. So if we try to return back the last name with the space in the property name, it's going to throw an error. We're not going to be able to retrieve that information back because it's got a space there, and when JavaScript encounters it, it sees the object last, and it doesn't recognize that last and name are part of the same property name. So you do need to make sure that you are double quoting around the property name and having the bracket in order to contain it as one item. So that's how you can set up a basic object and then retrieve back the data that's contained within the object using JavaScript code.